My name is Serafina Moon. For years, I was a whisper in my own life, a story half told and often misremembered, a faded photograph tucked away in the back of a drawer. They say the sea holds its secrets close, and for a long time, I held mine even closer, believing that silence was a shield. It was, in truth, a slow erosion. If you've ever felt the quiet ache of being unseen, of your truth being gently, almost politely, set aside, perhaps my journey will resonate. I'm sharing this not for accolades, nor to reopen old wounds, but for the hope that it might offer a little light to anyone navigating their own shadowed path, searching for the courage to reclaim their own narrative. Knowing someone is listening, truly listening, is a comfort, a reminder that we are not adrift alone. So, if you're here, thank you. Let me tell you how I learned to reclaim my voice, one quiet truth at a time. The salt-laced air of Seacliff Point, the small coastal town I'd retreated to, was usually a balm. But that autumn, it carried a familiar chill, the kind that settles deep in your bones not from the weather, but from memory. I'd come home, if you could call it that, after a career in the Navy that ended not with a bang, but with a carefully worded, career-eclipsing report. No one in town, not even my family, knew the full story of the Amber Coast incident, or why Commodore Moon, once a name spoken with a certain respect in maritime circles, was now just Serafina, the quiet woman in the cottage by the cove, the one who kept to herself. They assumed, I suppose, that I'd simply faded, stepped back, given up. And in the muted landscape of their assumptions, I let myself become a ghost, because the effort of explaining felt like trying to chart a course through a perpetual fog. The town's annual Founders' Day celebration was approaching, a nostalgic affair of bunting, local history displays, and a community barbecue down by the old pier. My sister, Isabel, was to be honored. She'd received a commendation for her volunteer work with the Coast Guard Auxiliary, something about organizing a particularly successful fundraising regatta. I was, of course, invited. An email from my mother, concise, and almost an afterthought. Isabel's getting her plaque at the Founders' Day picnic. We'll save you a sandwich. When I arrived, the scent of grilled fish and damp earth mingled with the cheerful cacophony of a small town celebrating itself. Isabel was radiant in her crisp auxiliary uniform, her dark hair pulled back neatly, her smile wide and genuine as she accepted congratulations. She'd always possessed an easy charm, a lightness I sometimes envied. My father, a man whose approval I'd chased for years like a ship chasing a distant lighthouse, stood beside her, his arm around her shoulder, his pride a palpable thing. My mother fussed with a tray of cookies, her gaze flicking towards me, then away, a familiar dance of acknowledgement and dismissal. There was no name card for me at the family's cluster of picnic tables, no space deliberately made. My Aunt Beatrice, her smile a little too bright, gestured vaguely towards a folding chair near the recycling bins. Serafina, dear, so good you could make it. Isabel's table is a bit full with her auxiliary friends. Why don't you find a spot over there? I nodded, the familiar ache a dull throb, and found a perch on the periphery, watching the gentle sway of the fishing boats in the harbor. Later, I wandered over to a trestle table laden with historical photographs, old schooners, stern-faced captains, faded maps of the coastline. My mother had curated a small section, grandfather in his merchant marine uniform, father's Naval Academy portrait, Isabel smiling proudly in her auxiliary dress blues. I scanned the display, a small, foolish hope flickering within me. The only formal photograph I'd ever given them, my own commissioning portrait from the Naval Academy, the one where my eyes held a future I still believed in, was gone. In its place was a more recent, casual snapshot of the family on a beach holiday, one taken long after I'd left active service. No uniform, no hint of the life I'd lived. "Mom?" I asked, keeping my voice light, as she passed with a pitcher of lemonade. "What happened to that old photo of me, the one from the academy?" She didn't meet my eyes, her attention fixed on a wasp, buzzing near the jam tarts. "Oh, that one. It was looking a bit faded, dear. and that frame was rather severe. We thought something a little more cheerful would be nice. Her words were soft, almost kind, yet they landed like tiny shards of glass. Faded, severe. Was that how they saw me, my service, my sacrifice? A cousin I hadn't seen in years ambled over, a plate piled high with potato salad. Serafina. Long time no see. What are you up to these days? Still doing whatever it was you used to do. Before I could form a reply, Isabel, having drifted over, answered for me, her laugh light and airy. Oh, Serafina's taking a well-deserved break. She used to be involved in maritime logistics, wasn't it, sis? Very complicated. Now she's enjoying the quiet life. Probably writing a book or birdwatching. Someone else chimed in, sensible. Much safer than being out on those rough seas. Better to be grounded. The ripple of polite laughter wasn't unkind. Not exactly. It was worse, indifferent. The casual dismissal of a life they'd never truly understood, nor, it seemed, cared to. I slipped away to refill my water bottle, needing a moment of quiet. As I stood by the water cooler, a voice, resonant and calm, spoke my name. Commodore Moon? Serafina Moon. I turned. He was an older gentleman, his posture still retaining a hint of command, his eyes sharp and intelligent. I didn't recognize him immediately. I'm sorry, I began. Professor Alaric Blackwood, he said, extending a hand. Retired naval historian. We met once, briefly, at a symposium on maritime strategy some years ago. I believe I reviewed a paper you co-authored on the Azure Strait evacuation protocols. A flicker of warmth spread through me. Professor Blackwood. Yes, I remember. Your critique was insightful. He smiled, a genuine, unforced expression. A remarkable piece of planning, that evacuation. Understated in the official reports, as these things often are, but a masterclass in coordination and courage. He paused, his gaze thoughtful. Not a lot of public commendation for that sort of intricate, life-saving work, was there? No, sir, I said, the words catching slightly in my throat. But the aim was to bring them home, not to earn accolades. He nodded, a gesture of profound understanding that cut through the afternoon's casual slights. Indeed, sometimes the most significant currents run deepest, unseen from the surface. He gave a small, respectful bow of his head. A privilege to see you again, Commodore. He moved on, leaving me with that small, unexpected gift of recognition. It was a lifeline thrown in a sea of polite indifference, a reminder that the story I carried, the one they'd tried to erase, still had weight, still had meaning, even if only in the quiet archives of memory. I returned to my solitary chair, the plastic cool beneath my hands, and watched the tide begin to turn. The honor, I reminded myself, wasn't in the frame on the wall, but in the knowing. And if someone, by chance, remembered the truth aloud, one didn't need to correct the silence. One simply had to let it resonate. The morning after the Founders' Day picnic, the house was quiet, imbued with the lingering scent of my mother's apple pie and the faintest trace of disillusionment. I rose before anyone else, the gray pre-dawn light filtering through the lace curtains of the guest room. Drawn by an old habit, I found myself in the living room, standing before the large oak cabinet that served as our family's unofficial museum of accomplishments. Father's service medals, grandfather's sepia-toned photograph in his crisp wartime uniform, Isabel's various sailing trophies, and now, her new auxiliary commendation plaque, all arranged with care. My gaze, almost involuntarily, searched for a space, a sign. There it was, not an emptiness, but an absence made conspicuous. A faint, rectangular outline on the polished wood of the top shelf, a slight discoloration where a frame had rested for years. My heart gave a small, unsteady beat. I knelt and opened the bottom drawer, the one that held a miscellany of forgotten things, old keys, spare batteries, tangled ribbons. And there, tucked beneath a stack of outdated maps, was my Naval Academy commissioning frame. The silver was a little tarnished, but the frame itself was intact. The photograph, however, was gone. In its place was the generic cardboard insert that came with new frames, printed with a silhouette of a smiling, anonymous graduate. As if the original occupant had never existed. My mother hadn't discarded it, I realized. That would have been too overt, too deliberate an act of erasure. Instead, she had simply unselved it. Removed the evidence, quietly, efficiently, like tidying away a seasonal decoration that no longer suited the decor. Not destroyed, merely omitted. Later, I found her in the kitchen, the morning sun illuminating the steam rising from her teacup. "When did you take my photograph out of the frame in the cabinet, Mom?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. She didn't startle. She continued to stir her tea, her gaze fixed on the robin hopping on the bird feeder outside the window. "Oh, I was just reorganizing things a bit, dear." That shelf was looking a little cluttered. One less frame helps it breathe. No one really pays much attention to those old things anyway. I nodded slowly, absorbing the familiar, gentle deflection. "I suppose you're right. No one noticing is often the intention." She offered no reply, just took a slow sip of her tea. The silence itself was an answer. That evening, dinner conversation revolved around Isabel's upcoming award ceremony. She'd been nominated for a regional Maritime Volunteer of the Year award, and the ceremony was to be held at the Seacliff Yacht Club, a place steeped in local nautical history. "They have this beautiful old chart room," Isabel said, her eyes shining with excitement. "They display the award recipients' photos on an easel for the evening. It's quite an honor." Mom clapped her hands softly. "That sounds wonderful, dear." A lovely recognition. She turned to me, her smile gentle but pointed. "Serafina, if you're planning on coming, perhaps something simple? That navy blue dress you have is very classic. Nothing too distracting, you know." I managed a small smile. "Of course. Wouldn't want to draw focus." I didn't say that I'd once briefed the Atlantic Fleet Command in full dress whites, under the scrutiny of admirals who decided the fate of thousands, a world away from the polite applause of the Seacliff Yacht Club. Here, even my quiet presence felt like it needed to be muted further. Later that night, long after the house had settled into its nocturnal rhythms, I was in the guest room, rereading a chapter of a book on coastal erosion, when my phone vibrated. An unfamiliar number. One short, encrypted message, inquiry active Amber Coast incident. Old logs surfaced via Maritime Historical Archive. Your designation flagged. Exercise caution. No signature, no context beyond those stark, chilling words. Amber Coast. A name I hadn't spoken, hadn't allowed myself to dwell on, for nearly 5 years. The operation that had fractured my career, the one where I'd chosen to fall on my sword to shield my crew and contain a spiraling crisis. The one I had buried so deep I thought its echoes had finally faded. Until now. I walked back into the living room, drawn again to the oak cabinet. The empty frame was still in the bottom drawer. I pulled it out, my fingers tracing the outline where my younger self, so full of conviction and hope, had once smiled out at the world. How many memories, I wondered, had been quietly edited, gently removed, because they no longer fit the preferred family narrative of uncomplicated success and local praise. The frame remained. It was just the picture inside that hadn't made the cut. And now, it seemed, someone was trying to paint a new, far more damaging picture, using the faded lines of my past. The Seacliff Yacht Club, perched on a bluff overlooking the restless gray expanse of the Pacific, was all polished brass, nautical charts under glass, and the scent of old wood and sea salt. I arrived a few minutes before the stipulated time, wearing a simple charcoal gray dress, elegant but unassuming, the kind of attire that could fade into the background or hold its own, depending on how one carried oneself. I presented my invitation to the young woman at the reception table. She scanned the guest list, her brow furrowed. "And you are with?" Before I could reply, Isabel swept in, a vision in a sapphire blue gown, her smile perfectly calibrated. "She's with me," Isabel told the attendant, a proprietary hand briefly on my arm. "My sister. She used to be in shipping logistics, I think. She's just here to support me." She gave me a quick, airy hug that barely made contact. I didn't react. Years of naval discipline had taught me to hold my composure, even when buffeted by undercurrents. Inside, the chart room buzzed with polite conversation. A string quartet played softly in a corner. On a velvet-draped easel near the small podium, a framed photograph of Isabel, smiling and confident in her auxiliary uniform, was prominently displayed. My assigned seat was at a small table towards the back, near the service entrance. No place card, no introduction to the other guests at the table, just a neatly folded napkin and a glass of lukewarm water. After the seafood chowder and a lengthy speech by the club commodore, Isabel was called to the podium. She glowed under the warm lights, her voice clear and confident as she accepted her award. "I want to share a little story," she began, her gaze sweeping the room. "When we were younger, my older sister, who was always so capable, so driven, once told me, after I'd struggled with a particularly challenging sailing lesson, 'Perhaps some things are just not for you, Isabel. Maybe you should find something simpler.'" Those words, she paused, a slight catch in her voice, they stayed with me. And they made me determined to prove that I could master the complexities, that I could navigate the challenging currents. A wave of sympathetic murmurs rippled through the room. A few heads turned towards me, their expressions a mixture of mild curiosity and that faint, pitying condescension one reserves for those perceived to have peaked too early or fallen from grace. I kept my expression neutral, my hands resting lightly in my lap. I wasn't going to be the silent, vaguely pathetic counterpoint in her narrative of triumph. I wouldn't engage with a memory so artfully reshaped for public consumption. The ceremony wound down. Awards were given, speeches made, polite applause echoed. Then, the heavy oak doors at the far end of the chart room opened. A man in a civilian suit, impeccably tailored, entered. He was not old, but he carried an air of quiet authority that instantly drew the eye. His silver hair was neatly cut, his gaze direct and assessing. Isabel, mid-conversation with the club commodore, saw him, and her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She moved to greet him. "Commander Cole, what a surprise." "I didn't realize you'd be." He acknowledged her with a polite nod, but his gaze swept past her, scanning the room before it settled, unequivocally, on me. He moved with an unhurried, deliberate pace, navigating the tables as if he were still on the bridge of a ship. He stopped before my table, his presence commanding a sudden, unexpected stillness in our corner of the room. He offered a slight, formal bow of his head. "Commodore Moon," he said, his voice calm but carrying clearly in the lull. "Serafina, it has been far too long." A fork clattered onto a plate nearby. Conversations faltered. My father, who had been holding court at a central table, turned, his expression momentarily losing its customary assurance. Someone at a neighboring table whispered, "Commodore? Did he say Commodore Moon?" Isabel's smile had frozen, her eyes wide, fixed on Cole and then on me, as if seeing a ghost walk through the wall. I inclined my head slowly. "Commander Cole. Adrian. It's good to see you. Thank you for coming." Commander Cole, a man renowned for his strategic mind during the Azure Strait evacuation, a crisis that had unfolded far from these placid shores, turned slightly to address the small group of local dignitaries who had accompanied him. "For those of you who may not be aware," he said, his tone measured but firm, his gaze briefly sweeping over my family's table, Commodore Moon was the lead strategist for the Azure Strait evacuation. Her innovative routing and coordination under extreme pressure saved over 700 civilian lives. It was a masterclass in crisis management, one that many in Fleet Command still study. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. His words, spoken with quiet conviction, hung in the air, shifting the atmosphere of the room as surely as a change in barometric pressure precedes a storm. For once, in this room, in this town, I didn't have to offer a single word of explanation or defense. The silence that followed was more eloquent than any speech. Later, as the guests began to mingle again, a young sea cadet, his uniform immaculate, his hands clasped nervously behind his back, approached me. "Excuse me, ma'am. Commodore Moon? Were you really?" I took a slow sip of my water, still lukewarm, still in the plain, unadorned glass, and met his earnest gaze. "Once," I said softly, "I had to make a choice. Follow a direct order that intelligence suggested was sound, or trust a gut feeling, a pattern I saw in the currents that others dismissed, which told me that hundreds of non-combatant vessels were in the path of a presumed safe corridor. I chose the latter. It meant diverting resources, challenging superiors, and accepting the risk of severe censure if I was wrong." I leaned forward just a fraction. "You tell me, son, what rank does that kind of decision earn you, regardless of what's on your sleeve?" He swallowed, his eyes wide. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The real honors I was beginning to remember were not the ones displayed on easels, but the ones etched into your conscience. I left the yacht club shortly thereafter without farewells. It wasn't a victory lap. It felt more like the turning of a key in a lock that had been rusted shut for years, the air that rushed in both bracing and unsettling, hinting at a reckoning long overdue. The next morning, the scent of the sea was sharper, the air clearer after an overnight rain. I sat at my small kitchen table, nursing a cup of tea, when an email landed in my inbox. The subject line made my breath catch: Amber Coast Incident, Archival Log Query, Urgent. It was from Elias Kane, a maritime blogger and independent historian known for his meticulous, often uncomfortably revealing, investigations into forgotten maritime events. "Commodore Moon," the email began, polite but direct. "I've recently obtained a partial, newly declassified operational log concerning the Amber Coast incident. Your name figures prominently. The log and accompanying anecdotal evidence I'm currently verifying suggests a command decision under your authority led to significant, previously unacknowledged, environmental contamination. I am seeking to understand the full context and offer you an opportunity to provide your perspective before I publish my findings." I read the email 3 times, each word a cold drop of seawater on my skin. My hands were steady, but a familiar tightness constricted my chest. I knew that incident, the one where an outdated tanker, caught in a rogue storm, had threatened to break apart near a fragile marine sanctuary. I knew the impossible choices, the conflicting reports, the pressure from above to prioritize commercial shipping lanes over immediate environmental containment. And I knew who had ultimately given the order that had led to a limited, but politically damaging, spill: Director Victor Sterling, then a fast-rising star in maritime logistics, a man who valued expediency above all else. I had voiced my objections, proposed an alternative that would have been slower but safer for the coastline. Sterling had overruled me in a closed-door briefing, citing overriding strategic imperatives. When the fallout came, I had accepted responsibility to shield my bridge crew, who had only been following the final, altered orders, and to prevent a wider public panic that Sterling had been desperate to avoid. But now that carefully buried history was being exhumed, and it seemed someone was intent on ensuring my name was solely attached to the blame. I immediately contacted Dr. Lena Petrova. Lena, a brilliant former naval intelligence analyst, now a data scientist specializing in secure information retrieval, had been my most trusted mind on more than one complex operation. Her discretion was legendary, her ability to find the truth in a maze of digital noise, unparalleled. I forwarded her Kane's email and the few cryptic details I had. Within hours, Lena called back, her voice uncharacteristically taut. "Serafina," she said, dispensing with pleasantries, "this is complicated." The initial query to the Maritime Historical Archive, the one that seems to have unearthed this specific log Kane is citing, It originated from an IP address registered to the Seacliff Point Harbormaster's office. Specifically, from a terminal Isabel Moon has access to as part of her auxiliary duties. The floor seemed to tilt beneath me, a slow, sickening lurch. Not Isabel. Not this. I drove to the Harbormaster's office, a small, weather-beaten building on the edge of the marina. No call ahead, no warning. I found Isabel in the cramped records room, surrounded by dusty charts and shipping ledgers, a half-eaten sandwich on the desk beside her. She looked up, startled, as I entered. I didn't waste time. I laid a printed copy of Lena's trace report on the desk between us. Did you access the Amber Coast files, Isabel? Did you send something to this blogger, Kane? Her gaze flickered from the report to my face, then down to her hands, which were twisting a pen. She didn't deny it. Her jaw tightened, a muscle feathering. I came across some old incident reports, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Chatter. Rumors about you, about Amber Coast. Things I'd never heard. People online, in these forums, they were saying you were reckless, that you covered something up. And you decided to share these rumors? Her head snapped up, her eyes bright with a pain I hadn't seen there before, mixed with a defiance that was new. I was tired, Serafina. Tired of everyone in this town, in this family, always talking about Commodore Moon, the brilliant strategist, the one who walked on water. Even when you were gone, even when you were just here, silent, it was always your shadow I was standing in. I wanted people to see that you weren't perfect, that maybe there was another story. The confession didn't sting with the sharp fire of betrayal I might have expected. Instead, a profound weariness settled over me, an emptiness like a bay dredged clean. I looked at her, not as the aspiring auxiliary officer, but as the little sister I'd taught to tie a bowline, the one whose tears I dried after a fall from her beloved sailboat. You think I don't understand what it feels like to have your story twisted, Isabel? I asked, my voice quiet but firm. To be diminished? To be overshadowed? The difference is, I never tried to diminish you to make myself feel larger. Isabel's composure finally cracked. A tear traced a path through the light dusting of powder on her cheek. I know it was wrong, Serafina. I regretted it almost immediately. But I just wanted, for once, not to be the afterthought. We sat in silence for a long moment, the rhythmic creak of the old building the only sound. Two sisters, caught in the crosscurrents of a long unspoken rivalry of love and resentment tangled like old fishing nets. Finally, I stood. I didn't come here to recriminate, Isabel, I said, my voice steady, though a cold knot had formed in my stomach. I came because the truth of Amber Coast is far more complex than a few lines in a declassified log. And if anyone, I leaned forward slightly, letting her feel the weight of my resolve, thinks they can use a distorted version of my past to tarnish the integrity of those who served honorably, or to rewrite history for their own agenda, they are about to discover just how meticulously I learned to navigate treacherous waters. The air in the secure, off-site naval archive, a climate-controlled vault Lena had managed to get us temporary, heavily restricted access to, was cold, humming with the silent, tireless breath of servers that guarded decades of maritime history. Lena, her face illuminated by the glow of a reinforced laptop, handed me a slim data stick. The Amber Coast primary comms log should be in the restricted review partition. Your old access codes might still work. Try Pathfinder 03. My fingers, surprisingly steady, typed the familiar sequence. The screen flickered, then a directory materialized, files upon files, a digital ghost fleet of past operations. One folder, marked with a discrete flag for priority oversight, Sterling, caught my eye. Lena nodded. That's him. Victor Sterling. He was head of maritime logistics and rapid response then. Ambitious even by naval standards. Inside the folder, nestled amongst dry reports and requisition forms, was an audio file, its timestamp corresponding to the critical hours of the Amber Coast incident. I clicked play. A hiss of static, then a voice, clipped and impatient, a voice I remembered with a chill that had nothing to do with the server room's temperature. Moon, your environmental caution is admirable but irrelevant. The priority is unimpeded channel access for the Omega convoy. Divert containment resources. I repeat, divert containment. The projected spill is within acceptable parameters for expedited resolution. That is a direct instruction, Commodore. Acknowledge. Sterling. His voice, clear and cold, explicitly redirecting critical resources away from the spill containment efforts I'd initiated, effectively ensuring the environmental damage would be worse, but the shipping lanes cleared faster. The official report later cited unexpectedly strong currents and communication delays for the extent of the spill. My dissent, my attempt to prioritize containment, had been conveniently omitted. Lena leaned closer. If this audio gets out, Serafina, Sterling is done. He's being touted for a major international maritime regulation post. This would destroy him. Loss of honors, investigation, the works. I nodded slowly, the coldness spreading through me. Elias Kane, the blogger, was already stirring the waters, his posts gaining traction. And Isabel. Isabel was now facing a formal inquiry at the Harbormaster's office for unauthorized access to sensitive archives. Suspension, possible dismissal from the auxiliary she cared so much about. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I walked into the Harbormaster's cramped office, wearing a simple blazer, no insignia, no hint of past rank. When the port captain, a stern but fair man named Morrison, asked me about Isabel's archive access, I spoke calmly. Captain Morrison, Isabel was acting at my informal request. I've been doing some private research into historical maritime incidents involving my family's service, and I asked her if she could look up some old logs for me. If there was any breach of protocol in how she accessed those files, the responsibility is mine alone. A lie, a shield. Morrison looked at me, his gaze shrewd. You're saying she was merely assisting you, Commodore Moon? Yes, I replied. She was. Any misjudgment was mine. That evening, I returned to the small cottage I rented by the cove. Something felt off. The door, usually sticking slightly in its frame, opened smoothly. Inside, nothing seemed overtly disturbed. But when I went to my desk, to the locked drawer where I'd secured the data stick with Sterling's audio, it was gone. In its place, laid precisely in the center of the blotter, was a small, intricately carved wooden seabird, a sandpiper. I stared at it, a cold dread seeping into me. That sandpiper was the unofficial emblem, the calling card, of a highly discreet, often ruthless, internal investigation unit that Sterling had controversially commanded years ago. A unit supposedly disbanded. My phone felt heavy in my hand as I dialed Lena's secure number. It rang, unanswered. I sent an encrypted text. No reply. I checked the secure messaging app we used. Her status, offline for the past 6 hours. A quick, discreet inquiry through an old, trusted contact confirmed my fear. Lena had signed out of her research facility late the previous evening, but her car was still in the parking lot. She hadn't been seen since. Disappeared, as if swallowed by the coastal fog. I sat in the deepening twilight, the wooden sandpiper cool in my palm. This was no longer just about a tarnished reputation or a sister's misguided attempt to step out of a shadow. This was Sterling, actively, ruthlessly suppressing the truth. And Lena, my friend, was caught in his net. The quiet war of whispers had just escalated, and the first casualty was silence. The door to my small, borrowed office at the Maritime Strategy Institute, a courtesy afforded to visiting researchers, was sealed. A strip of official-looking gray tape, embossed with the Institute's crest and the words "Access temporarily restricted, administrative review pending," stretched across the jamb. It was a politely worded lockout, a bureaucratic shunning. In the quiet, academic corridors of Seacliff Point, This was the equivalent of being publicly pilloried. I didn't need an explanation. Sterling's reach, it seemed, was longer and more insidious than I'd imagined. I stood there for a moment, the silence of the empty hallway pressing in, then turned and walked away. No arguments, no demands. Just a cold, hardening resolve. My phone buzzed as I stepped out into the crisp autumn air. Unlisted number. I hesitated, then answered. Commodore Moon? The voice was smooth, cultured, with an underlying layer of iron. Unmistakably Sterling. Or is it just Ms. Moon now? I hear you've been stirring old currents. Some things, Serafina, are best left in the deep. I'm offering you a quiet harbor, a comfortable, early retirement. Your sister's little indiscretion at the harbor master's office can be smoothed over. You simply let the Amber Coast rest where it lies, a regrettable but closed chapter. A historical footnote, with your name mentioned, perhaps, with gentle regret. I said nothing, letting the silence stretch, feeling the weight of his implied threat. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Consider it, Serafina. Some storms are not worth weathering twice. I ended the call without a word. The offer wasn't for peace, it was for capitulation. By late afternoon, Isabel appeared at my cottage door. The fire I'd seen in her eyes at the harbor master's office was back, brighter now, tempered with a steely determination I hadn't witnessed in her for years, perhaps ever. I found something, she said, her voice low and urgent, bypassing any preamble. She held out a battered, local authority laptop. You're on administrative leave, Isabel, I reminded her gently. She nodded, a curt, dismissive gesture. Which means I have time. And I still have friends down at the Port Authority who owe me a favor or two, and who don't like bullies any more than I do. I got access to the deep server logs for the public terminals at the port. I traced the IP address that initiated the remote wipe of the Amber Coast audio backup from the historical archive server. She took a breath. It originated from a Port Authority guest terminal, accessed with a temporary credential issued to Director Victor Sterling during his courtesy visit last month. I stared at her. Isabel, if they find out you bypass security protocols again. Her chin lifted. I helped dig this hole, Serafina. Partly for you, mostly for me. I was so busy trying to tear down your lighthouse, I didn't realize I was sinking my own boat. I won't let him, or my own past foolishness, silence the truth, or you again. I didn't reach for her, didn't offer words of comfort or caution. I simply looked away for a moment, towards the gray, turbulent sea, because the sudden surge of gratitude and a fierce, protective love for this complicated, determined sister of mine felt too raw, too overwhelming to voice. Later that evening, as the wind howled around the eaves of the cottage, an encrypted notification pinged on my secure tablet. The sender ID was scrambled, the message brief, almost a whisper in the digital ether, alive. LH Station North Point. Comms relay. Have copies. Sterling's courier is key. Al. Lena. My heart leaped. North Point Lighthouse Station was a decommissioned, semi-derelict facility a few miles up the coast, notoriously difficult to access. She was alive, and she still had the evidence. I immediately sent a coded, single-burst transmission to Commander Adrian Cole. If anyone could orchestrate a quiet, unofficial extraction from a place like North Point without tripping every alarm Sterling might have in place, it was Cole, with his network of loyal, discreet former operatives. And then, Noah. Noah, one of my brightest, most thoughtful students from the few guest lectures I'd given at the Maritime Strategy Institute, appeared at my cottage door as if summoned by the rising tension. He'd found Isabel and me huddled over nautical charts and satellite images of North Point spread across my kitchen table. He didn't ask questions, didn't intrude. He simply stood quietly by the doorway, his young face serious, observant, until we acknowledged him. Then, with a perceptiveness that belied his years, he asked, "Commodore Moon, ma'am, Do you think that sometimes telling the truth requires as much careful planning, as much strategic thinking, as a naval maneuver? I studied his earnest face, seeing in him a glimmer of the idealism I myself had once possessed, an idealism I was now fighting to reclaim. Every single time, Noah, I said softly. Especially when you believe that no victory, however small, is worth the loss of your moral compass. He nodded slowly, a profound understanding in his eyes. Then, with a quiet, "Let me know if there's anything a good navigator can do to help chart a course," he slipped away as unobtrusively as he'd arrived. That young man, I thought, would make an exceptional officer if the system didn't grind his integrity down first. Just before the clock ticked over to midnight, another alert flashed across my tablet. An internal security bulletin from a source Cole had cultivated within Sterling's sphere. Director Victor Sterling was slated to be the keynote speaker and recipient of a prestigious Lifetime Achievement in Maritime Governance award at the International Maritime Heritage Summit in Astoria, just across the river, in 3 days. I knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in my veins, what that meant. Sterling wasn't just going to accept an award, he was going to cement his legacy, bury any lingering whispers about Amber Coast under an avalanche of accolades and carefully curated narratives. If there were still fragments of truth floating in the murky waters of the past, he intended to ensure they were netted, neutralized, and sunk without a trace, all under the polite gaze of the international maritime community. I stared at the screen, the cursor blinking, a silent dare. Time had run out. The quiet retreat was over. The storm I had tried for so long to outrun had not only found me, it had sent an engraved invitation to its grand finale. From the window of my small, temporarily reinstated office at the Maritime Strategy Institute, a quiet concession after Cole had made a few pointed calls, I watched the cadets on the training grounds below. They moved with precision, their drills rehearsed, their futures seemingly mapped out on the smooth green expanse. Each synchronized step was a distant echo of a life I'd once led, a path I'd thought irrevocably closed. Teaching, sharing the hard-won lessons of command and consequence, had been a quiet solace, a way to channel the tides of regret into something constructive. But it wasn't enough, not anymore. Not if I allowed Sterling to entomb the truth beneath a monument of lies. Cole, true to his reputation for discreet efficiency, had sent me a securely encrypted file. Its subject line, Astoria, suggested points of interest. Inside was not a tourist guide, but a meticulously detailed schematic of the conference center, highlighting lightly monitored service entrances, shift-change vulnerabilities in security patrols, and, most intriguingly, a disused AV patch panel in a forgotten storage closet, its wiring still connected, albeit dormant, to the main auditorium's sound system. A chance. A narrow channel, fraught with risk, but a channel nonetheless. A strategist knows that no plan is impervious to the unpredictable currents of execution. We prepare, we adapt, we act. Isabel, when I outlined the bare bones of the idea, didn't hesitate. "Let me be your inside person, Serafina," she said, her voice steady, her eyes clear. "I can get access." The Seacliff Point Historical Society has a small display booth at the summit. I'm still technically a volunteer. No one will question me being there, especially now Captain Morrison has clarified my archive access as being at your request. She paused, then met my gaze directly. "I owe you this. I owe myself this. I want to help navigate this one right." I looked at her, seeing not the resentful younger sister, but a woman stepping into her own strength, charting her own course towards redemption. The risk was enormous for both of us. But this time, her resolve felt anchored, not in a desire to diminish me, but to stand alongside me. On the afternoon of the summit, Isabel, dressed in the conservative attire of a historical society volunteer, her ID badge prominently displayed, entered the bustling Astoria Conference Center through a designated exhibitor's entrance. Tucked discreetly into the lining of her shoulder bag was a miniature, high-fidelity audio player, no bigger than a credit card, loaded with the damning recording of Sterling's Amber Coast directive. I monitored her progress from a borrowed observation post, a dusty, vacant office in an adjacent building Cole had arranged access to, my laptop linked via a secure, short-range encrypted signal to a tiny receiver Isabel carried. My fingers hovered over the command key that would activate the audio feed to the patched AV panel. Inside, during a scheduled Q&A session following a panel on sustainable maritime futures, Isabel, feigning a query about historical preservation grants, approached the microphone nearest to where Sterling sat, looking composed and authoritative, amongst other dignitaries. As she began her innocuous question, Sterling, his eyes briefly flicking towards her with a dismissive air, leaned into his own microphone. "It's vital," he intoned, his voice resonating through the auditorium, "that we celebrate progress, not mire ourselves in the minor, unavoidable incidents of the past." Idealists, however well-intentioned, his gaze seemed to sweep over Isabel, a subtle but unmistakable dismissal, often fail to grasp the complex realities of operational command, where difficult, sometimes unpalatable, decisions are necessary for the greater strategic good. That was my cue. I hit send. Sterling's own voice, cold and precise from 5 years prior, suddenly boomed from the auditorium speakers. "Moon, your environmental caution is admirable but irrelevant. The priority is unimpeded channel access. The projected spill is within acceptable parameters. That is a direct instruction, Commodore. Acknowledge." For a heart-stopping 3 seconds, the auditorium was plunged into stunned silence. Then, a crackle of static and the audio died. Someone, Sterling's security or the venue's tech team, had found and severed our link to the patch panel. From my vantage point, I saw movement near the service alley where Noah, against my better judgment, but with a quiet insistence I couldn't refuse, was monitoring our backup wireless relay. A dark-suited figure darted from the shadows. I saw Noah turn, then stumble, his hands flying up to protect his head as he was roughly shoved against a brick wall, his laptop clattering to the ground. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just about discrediting Sterling anymore, it was about protecting those who dared to help. I raced down the service stairs, my mind a whirlwind of contingency plans. Noah was shaken, his cheekbone already bruising, but he gritted his teeth. "The laptop's smashed, Commodore. But the drive's intact." He pressed a small, ruggedized flash drive into my hand. My hands, trained for crisis, moved swiftly, plugging the drive into my own hardened tablet. My mind, however, was burning with a cold fury. This was no longer a strategic game of cat and mouse. Sterling had crossed a line. Back in the observation post, I bypassed the compromised AV system. I initiated a direct, encrypted data burst to Elias Kane, the blogger, who I knew was live-streaming commentary on the summit from the press room. His feed was independent, harder to shut down quickly. I held my tablet, its small microphone activated, and spoke, my voice low but carrying the full weight of my conviction, not as Commodore Moon, the strategist, but as Seraphina Moon, the witness. "My name is Seraphina Moon." For years, a shadow of doubt was cast over my service concerning the Amber Coast incident. Today, you heard the voice of Director Victor Sterling, giving the direct order that prioritized commercial interests over environmental safety, an order that led to the very damage for which others were allowed to believe I was solely culpable. When those in power manipulate records and silence dissent, the truth becomes the first casualty. Silence is not strategy, it is complicity. The connection held. On Kane's live feed, which I now monitored on a second screen, my words were followed by the crystal-clear replay of Sterling's damning order. Inside the auditorium, visible on the live feed camera panning the shocked faces, every head had turned towards Victor Sterling. And this time, no one was applauding. They didn't use restraints. There were no raised voices, no overt accusations. Just a polite, firm escort by conference security through a labyrinth of back corridors to a sterile, windowless meeting room deep within the bowels of the Astoria Conference Center. The kind of room designed for discreet interrogations or damage control, all beige walls, fluorescent lighting, and an air thick with unspoken implications. Isabel sat beside me, pale but composed, her hands folded calmly in her lap. The silence stretched, heavy and purposeful. Then, Victor Sterling walked in. His expensive suit was immaculate, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, but his eyes held a glacial fury, and the knuckles of his clasped hands were white. The mask of the elder statesman had slipped, revealing the ruthless operator beneath. "I am offering you a lifeline, Serafina," he began, his voice a low, dangerous purr, ignoring Isabel entirely. "A way out of this unfortunate spectacle you've orchestrated. A quiet, dignified departure. Full honors, perhaps a commendation for past services discreetly rendered. Your sister walks away from her misguided enthusiasm, without further consequence. Your young cadet friend, Noah, will find his minor scrape with security forgotten. And you, Serafina, will be allowed to fade into a comfortable, well-compensated obscurity, your name preserved in the margins of history, untarnished by this messy business." I met his gaze, unflinching. "You still don't understand, do you, Victor?" I said, my voice quiet but carrying the resonance of long-suppressed conviction. I was never fighting for honors or for a particular version of my legacy. I was fighting for the simple, unassailable truth. For the integrity of the service we both swore to uphold. For the dignity of not having one's voice, one's ethical concerns, erased by those who value power over principle. He let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound like ice cracking. Dignity? Truth? Quaint notions, Serafina. In the real world. The door behind him opened abruptly. Commander Adrian Cole entered, his expression unreadable, followed by Noah, his arm in a makeshift sling fashioned from his college scarf, his young face set with a fierce determination. And then, Lena. Dr. Lena Petrova. She was paler, thinner, her eyes shadowed with fatigue, but she walked with an unbroken spirit. She stepped forward, bypassing Sterling as if he were a piece of furniture, and placed a small, encrypted data drive on the polished table between us. It landed with a soft, definitive click, like a gavel falling. "Complete communication logs from the Amber Coast incident," Lena stated, her voice clear and steady. "Including Director Sterling's explicit orders to bypass environmental protocols, his subsequent directives to alter official records, and financial trails linking a shell corporation involved in the expedited cleanup, directly to his private interests. All verified. All uncorrupted." Sterling lunged, his hand shooting out to grab the drive, but Isabel, moving with surprising speed, stepped between them. She stood her ground, her slight frame a sudden, unexpected barrier, her eyes, no longer shadowed by doubt, blazing with a newfound fire. "I used to be afraid of men like you, Director Sterling," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that astonished me. "Afraid of the power you wielded, the way you could dismiss people, erase them. Not anymore. I took an oath to serve with honor." That oath didn't include blind loyalty to corruption, however highly decorated. Before Sterling could react, more figures filled the doorway. Not conference security this time, but two plainclothes investigators from the Oregon Port Authority, their expressions grim, accompanied by a uniformed state trooper. Elias Kane's relentless live-blogging, amplified by Cole's discreet calls to certain interested parties, had apparently set official inquiries in motion with remarkable speed. Sterling stared at them, then at us, his composure finally shattering, his face a mask of disbelief. He had prepared for a battle of reputations, of carefully managed narratives. He had never anticipated a war fought with irrefutable truth, waged by those he had long underestimated. On our way out, a paramedic intercepted me in the corridor. Noah, despite his stoicism, had sustained a mild concussion and a hairline fracture in his wrist when he'd been shoved. They were taking him to the local hospital for observation. I stood by his gurney for a moment, my hand resting briefly on his uninjured arm. "He's a brave young man," Cole said quietly, appearing at my side. "But he's not trained for this kind of engagement." "No," I replied, my gaze fixed on Noah's pale but resolute face. But he understood the core principle better than many who are. He reminded me that courage doesn't always wear a uniform or carry a weapon. Sometimes it's simply the quiet, unwavering choice to stand for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against you. Days later, back in the quiet solitude of Seacliff Point, a formal communication arrived from a high-level Naval Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. An offer of a prestigious advisory position. A seat at the table where strategic decisions were made, where influence was wielded. Power, prestige, a chance to reshape the narrative from within. I read the offer twice, then carefully folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. I had climbed that ladder once. I knew the view from the summit. I also knew the rarefied air, the subtle pressures, the silences that often lived at those heights. Instead, I walked across the autumn-browned quad to the modest building that housed the Maritime Strategy Institute. I had lectures to prepare, young minds to engage, not with tales of past glories or grievances, but with the enduring complexities of ethical command. My path forward wasn't about reclaiming a lost pinnacle of power, but about cultivating the ground from which new, more principled leaders might grow. And this time, I wouldn't be doing it in silence. The headlines rippled through maritime news outlets and even some mainstream media, initially with a tone of cautious disbelief, then with growing certainty. Director Victor Sterling suspended pending investigation into Amber Coast irregularities. Financial misconduct allegations surface in naval logistics scandal. My name, Serafina Moon, appeared too, but not as the disgraced officer of Sterling's carefully constructed narrative. Instead, I was Commodore RET Serafina Moon, key witness in uncovering historical malfeasance. It wasn't vindication in the triumphant, fist-pumping sense. It was more like the slow, steady easing of a crushing weight, the first deep, unimpeded breath after surfacing from a long, suffocating dive. Then came the summons, not to a court of law, but to an internal naval review board. A hearing to clarify historical command decisions and subsequent actions related to the Amber Coast incident. The panel of senior officers seated before me included some faces I recognized, men and one woman, who, years ago, had politely accepted the official, sanitized version of events, who had perhaps, in their own climb up the ladder, found it expedient not to look too closely at the shadows. I wore a simple civilian suit. No medals, no ribbons. I brought no legal counsel, only the unadorned truth. I didn't raise my voice, didn't assign blame beyond the facts Lena's data had laid bare. I simply recounted the events, the pressures, the choices I had made, and why. I never sought to be a martyr, admirals, I concluded, my gaze steady. Nor did I seek to be a whistleblower. I sought only to do my duty with integrity. Silence, in the face of ethical compromise, is not neutrality, it is acquiescence. And I will never apologize for choosing to disturb a peace that was built upon deceit. The board's decision came swiftly, full restoration of my honorific rank and a formal acknowledgement of the undue professional hardship I had endured. Any suggestion of my culpability in the Amber Coast environmental damage was officially expunged. Isabel, who had submitted her own candid statement, received a formal letter of caution from the auxiliary for her initial unauthorized archive access, but was cleared of any malicious intent and her volunteer status was reinstated. We walked out of that austere hearing room together, Isabel and I, not as the perfectly polished daughters our parents might once have envisioned, nor as the tarnished figures our detractors had tried to paint us, but simply as two women who had navigated a storm and found their way back to solid, if forever changed, ground. Whole. A few days later, I drove to the house I grew up in, a place I hadn't willingly stepped inside for nearly a decade. The scent of beeswax and old roses was the same. On the mantelpiece in the living room, where grandfather's portrait and father's medals still held pride of place, a new edition had appeared. My Naval Academy commissioning photograph, in its original silver frame, now polished bright. It stood beside Isabel's recent auxiliary commendation. A quiet, unheralded rebalancing of the family narrative. My mother stood in the doorway, her hands clasped, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, her composure, usually so steadfast, seemed to soften. We never understood, she said, her voice barely a whisper, thick with unshed tears. I never knew love could be so silent. And that silence, so cruel in its own way. I nodded. There was no anger left in me, only a deep, settled weariness and perhaps the first stirrings of a fragile peace. I'm not here to lay blame, Mom. I'm just here to finally lay down the weight of it. My father, a man of few words, a man whose disapproval had once felt like a physical blow, emerged from his study. He didn't speak, but he handed me a small, hand-carved wooden box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a miniature, intricately detailed model of the first patrol boat I had ever commanded. Beside it, a letter, his familiar, angular handwriting on thick cream paper, dated just weeks after I had quietly resigned my commission. An unsent letter. Serafina, it began. I didn't know how to say I was still proud. I didn't know if you'd even want to hear it from me then. Some storms, a man just doesn't know how to navigate with his children. I didn't read the rest of it there, in front of them. I simply tucked the box and the letter into my jacket pocket, close to my heart, where their fragile, belated truths belonged. Back at the Maritime Strategy Institute, a new notice had been pinned to the corkboard outside the cadet refectory. It was an informal photograph, taken by Noah, of me, Isabel, Lena, and Cole, standing on the bluffs overlooking the Astoria Bridge, the wind whipping our hair, genuine smiles on our faces. Beneath it, someone, Noah, I suspected, had scrawled in bold marker, "Leadership isn't about the shine of the medals. It's about the steadfastness of the compass." She didn't fight for attention. She fought for attention to the truth. And in that moment, looking at that candid, unposed photograph, I understood. Legacy wasn't something conferred by rank or etched onto plaques. It was carried in the choices one made, in the truths one dared to speak, and in the lessons that others, if you were fortunate, chose to remember and carry forward. The next morning, I walked into the lecture hall for my seminar on ethical command in contested waters. No insignia on my collar, no spotlight, just a clean whiteboard and a room full of young, expectant faces, minds ready to grapple with complexities beyond textbook theories. This isn't just a class about naval strategy or maritime law, I began, my voice clear and steady in the quiet room. It's a class about what happens after the fog of war lifts, or in the silent corridors of power where decisions are made far from the sound of gunfire. It's about what happens when silence itself becomes more dangerous than any storm, and when the truth becomes a commodity, auctioned off to the highest bidder or the most compelling lie. Today, I paused. Meeting their gaze, we begin to learn not just how to navigate the seas, but how to navigate the even more treacherous waters of command with your moral compass intact. How to win, if you must, and still walk away with your soul. Time, I discovered, flows differently when you are no longer trying to outrun your past, but rather, learning to integrate its lessons into the present. Each morning, brewing coffee in the small, sunlit staff kitchenette at the Maritime Strategy Institute, I'd watch the early light slant across the worn whiteboard in my classroom, illuminating the previous day's diagrams of ethical decision trees or historical case studies. The rhythmic cadence of cadets' footsteps in the hallway became a familiar, reassuring sound, like the steady pulse of a place dedicated to growth and reflection. There were no grand pronouncements of my vindication, no celebratory dinners. Just a quiet continuity, a sense of purpose that felt more grounding than any medal or public accolade. One morning, as I was chalking the words moral intelligence, beyond compliance on the board, Noah walked in, his arm now free of the sling, though he still favored it slightly. He offered a quiet nod and took his usual seat in the front row. He'd become an unofficial teaching assistant, his insights often sharper and more nuanced than many of his peers. After the lecture, as students filed out discussing the nuances of a particularly thorny scenario involving conflicting loyalties, I found a small, folded piece of paper on Noah's desk. Unfolding it, I read, "I used to think courage was about bold actions, loud declarations. Now I understand it's more often the quiet truth, spoken with conviction, especially when it feels like no one is listening or when the powerful prefer silence. Thank you for teaching us to listen for it." I held that note for a long moment, the simple, heartfelt words a profound affirmation. That quiet truth, that was the bedrock I had almost allowed to erode. Isabel didn't return to her volunteer post at the harbormaster's office, nor did she pursue reinstatement with the Coast Guard Auxiliary, though both were offered. Instead, she surprised us all by co-founding a small, fiercely independent civilian oversight group, Clearwater Advocates, dedicated to investigating and publicizing environmental and ethical lapses within local maritime industries and port authorities. It was underfunded, understaffed, and perpetually embattled, but Isabel threw herself into it with a passion and tenacity I'd never seen in her before. Why this Isabel? I asked her one afternoon, over coffee at a windswept cafe overlooking the turbulent mouth of the Columbia River. She smiled, a genuine, unforced smile that reached her eyes. Because if anyone knows what it feels like to have your concerns dismissed, your voice silenced by the very system you're trying to serve, it's me. And because, she added, her gaze thoughtful, I've learned that sometimes the most important navigation is helping others find their own true north, especially when the official charts are misleading. I couldn't argue with her logic. She was no longer sailing in anyone's shadow. She was charting her own distinct, courageous course. A month later, on a crisp, clear day, Isabel and I drove up the coast to the bluff overlooking the Azure Strait, the scene of the evacuation that Commander Cole had so unexpectedly brought to light. The sea below was a dazzling expanse of sapphire and jade. We didn't speak much. We simply stood there, the wind whipping our hair, and together we laid a small, simple wreath of wildflowers and sea grasses at the base of a weathered, unnamed marker that local fishermen sometimes used as a navigational aid. No grand memorial, no official recognition. Just a quiet acknowledgement of the lives saved, the choices made, the currents of memory that still flowed strong and deep. Grief shared in truth, I was learning, often needs no words. It finds its solace in the silent spaces between breaths, in the shared horizon. The night before I was due to give my final lecture of the term, a secure, anonymized message appeared on my tablet. No sender ID, no traceable origin, just a few carefully chosen words. Serafina, the fissures in the seawall of institutional silence haven't magically healed. The tides of expediency still pull strong. But now, those who would obscure the truth know you are not a solitary lighthouse keeper. There are other lights on the water. And they know you are not standing alone. I didn't try to trace the sender. I didn't need to. I saved the feeling the message evoked, the quiet strength that comes not from being unscarred, but from having weathered the storm and chosen to help others navigate the aftermath. The next morning, I stepped into the lecture hall. The door clicked softly shut behind me, sealing out the everyday sounds of the Institute, creating a space of focused attention. Rows of young faces, earnest and expectant, looked up. They were waiting not just for information, but for something more, a connection, a spark of understanding. I didn't begin with tactical formations or maritime law. I didn't recite doctrine or regulations. I told them a story. My story. About how a woman, once quietly relegated to the margins, a nobody in the grand scheme of power, had refused to let that silence define her legacy. How she, with the help of others who also valued truth, had fought not for personal glory, not for applause, but for the fundamental right to name her own experience, and for the courage to name what truly matters, even when it is inconvenient or unpopular. "You will not always be believed," I said, my voice resonating with a calm conviction I had earned through fire. "Your integrity will be tested. You will face pressures to conform, to stay silent, to choose the easier, more politically expedient path. But I urge you, live your lives, lead your commands, in such a way that when the truth finally, inevitably surfaces, as it always does, it will recognize you as an ally, not an adversary. Know that some of the most profound victories are the quiet ones, the ones that don't make the headlines, but slowly, surely, heal the soul and restore faith in our shared humanity. Truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply, stubbornly, refuses to be buried. And when you choose to stand, not for the ovation but for your own unwavering integrity, you become not just a leader, but a beacon. Unshakable,